in national strategic policy and work to enhance the benefits of military personnel, especially those in the Guard and Reserve units. He also worked to protect the nation's environmental assets, particularly the oceans and coral reefs. I ask you to join me in giving him a round of applause and to welcome him.
Sejus Masi Maryland, buenos días todos hamzo, coloniam zuni manauto e legislatura en agradeciste na dinanya para tafanguentos diri por estado politicar. Zawa na be menciona na si Speaker Wampat, si Hope dan si Maryland and Guam mismo no todos han manautos nanya antes dan. Sinanya rules. Just thought I'd tell that out. I know there are other Sinanya people out there. Let's go, Sinanya. All right. Now that I've ruined my whole presentation because there are others from other places, but normally I don't do PowerPoints. I just try to make powerful points. That's what I normally do. But there's a very and I appreciate the work of Carlisle on this and his generosity in terms of his efforts and trying to bring us to understanding this. But there's a whole bunch of things out there that are very difficult to kind of internalize because they really are a lot of conflicting trends, and sometimes we don't really bring a level of I don't know, maybe a kind of a comprehensive overview. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to provide this. The desire to make progress and develop politically and the impetus to engage in an act of self-determination are the twin motivations for our island's social progress. They speak to the essence of any society, and they can be charted in the context of very unique histories. And one of the things that we have to focus in is our particular unique history. And in the case of Guam, the compendium of historical circumstances have really led us to where we're at here in the year 2011. The compendium kind of winds its way back through our own history that includes settlement by the original inhabitants probably 4,000 years ago. Between that time frame, 4,000 years ago, and the appearance of the West in 1521 and the invasion in 1668, we are really unsure about all the dynamics of social change that occurred before the arrival of the West and all the multiple possible waves of migration that may have occurred from multiple sources. But we usually fix our ancient Chamorro past at the time of Western intrusion during the lifetimes of Diego Zambatores and Kepuha, Hurao, and Matapan. And that's the kind of first lodestar, if you will, where we kind of fix this. It may not be the only lodestar, but it is a primary lodestar, and that's the lodestar that the Tautotano brings to this celebration. But we are the inhabitants of that very first island, Pacific Island, to be colonized by the West. In the words of the great Pacific anthropologist Douglas Oliver, the rape of Oceania began with Guam. From that point on, to being part of the Spanish Empire, to being governed from Mexico, to being a subunit of the Philippines, to the arrival of the U.S. in 1898, World War II, the international recognition of non-self-governing areas in the post-World War II era, to our own internal political foment, and very distinct measures of incremental progress, we are at a point here in 2011 where this generation, your generation, our generation, no matter how you look at it, is commanded to do our part in ensuring that, not that we have a cataclysmic event of sorts, but that we continue the desire for political change and political self-fulfillment in a way that brings honor to those who came before us and all of us, and which will inspire those who become afterwards. So I start this by saying that we ought to take a look at our historical experience, that we have to review those experiences critically. We have to know what they are. We can't just kind of bluff our way through it. And I hear so many people kind of just bluff their way through. They don't really understand a lot of the things that they're talking about. They just use them because they sound very convenient. So I would say, you know, you have to go retro. You have to be retrospective before you're introspective. So go retro before you be intro. And so that's where, you know, and I take this opportunity because that's what I am, basically, an historian. Okay? And then inspiration to aspiration. Historical inspiration always leads us to future aspirations. We like to say that the political destiny is in our hands. That's a rhetorical flourish that we like to say. But in reality, it's not. Not entirely. Could be, depends on what we do, depends on how we triangulate this process. Someone came to me and said, can we take advantage of the Arab Spring because the Obama administration is paying homage to what's going on in Tunisia and what happened in Egypt? I said, yes, we can. If you can get 10,000 people in the street, then you can be the Chamorro Spring. Yes. But if all you're going to get is 10 people, don't bother. Don't waste our time. So political, it is in your hands if you really take it into your hands. But the reality is that political control is in the hands of Washington. They control the instruments of everything that we do politically. Some people lament that, some people are depressed by that, other people are comforted by that, but the reality that we have is that we are, in fact, the political structure we have, the legal structure, the framework that we have, are things that are governed out of the processes that exist in Washington, D.C. And we can be inspired by our heroes or depressed by our colonial past and present, and I'm always fond of saying that you can be inspired and you can aspire, but in order to get where you want to get, you have to perspire. And if you're not going to perspire, you're not willing to perspire, then forget all the inspirational talk and all the aspirations in the world don't amount to a hill of beans unless you're willing to put in the work that it takes. And that takes a lot of collaboration and coordination with others. All right. We begin with a discussion of the Tautotano. And the Tautotano is what we normally refer to, you know, there's a lot of indigenous dance groups, and we refer to these people as the Tautotano, as the people who were here originally. And we are the spiritual and physical and cultural inheritors of that legacy who were conquered. For those of us today, we say that we reject the conquest, but at the same time that we say that we reject the conquest, we have to really understand we were really conquered. We were really conquered. That's an important thing to remember. You don't have elements of control over your life. You were really conquered. We were really conquered. That system of indigenous governance, however it existed, was destroyed. And it has been totally obliterated. And so what we are left with is an emerging Chamorro people. And that's a slightly different phenomena. A phenomena that I think has been kind of overlooked. And that is that the Chamorro people emerged as a people in much the same way that the Filipino people emerged in the 19th century. And in much the same way that the Mexican people emerged in the 19th century. And that was a mixture of original identity and a kind of a national identity. That's who the Chamorro people were. So the term Chamorro itself, even though it existed for a couple of centuries before that, really came into its own in the 19th century. In the same way that the word Mexican came to its own, Mexicano, and in the same way that the word Filipino came into its own. And interestingly, the word Filipino was originally meant to refer to Spaniards who were born in the Philippines, eventually kind of manifested, twisted and turned, and became the articulator of the Filipino national identity. So we have this. This is the desire to build a kind of a nation. This is a slightly different phenomena, and it's very different than the kind of concern with indigenous issues, which came later on towards the end of the 20th century. It's a very different phenomenon, but very clear that Spanish authorities, American authorities, as they came in at the beginning of the 20th century, understood that when they were talking about the political essence of Guam, they were talking about these people who called themselves Chamorros. And who were these people? These people were your grandparents, these people were your great-grandparents, these people were your great-great-grandparents. My concern is always that when I hear a lot of enthusiasm given to Tautotano, which I share, I just don't want to look past my grandparents and my great-grandparents and my great-great-grandparents, because they had a design for life too. They understood the world in a certain way. And that's the world that, basically provided the basis for what most of us assume became part of our original Chamorro identity. So in the political processes of the 19th century, such as they existed, colonialism, I use the C word freely and liberally, the good thing about the Spaniards and the good thing about the British is that they acknowledged they were colonial. So they had colonial offices. The unfortunate part about the U.S. is that they deny that they're a colony, so they don't have a colonial office. They call it something else, the Department of Interior. So, the political processes of the 19th century allows those, even though they saw it in a different framework, they understood. See, the one thing that a colonizer understands when they understand the relationship is that they are not the colonized. They know that there's a distinction. Now, they may argue that, I have to help you along because you're not ready yet. You're not just ready yet, and I'll have to help you along, but we're in this kind of relationship. But I know that you're not me, and I'm not you. And so that division is there. But there is in that process, there is an acknowledgement. There is acknowledgement of who was in control and who was being controlled. And so even the Spaniards acknowledged that, and even certainly in early American rule, that was acknowledged. Of course, this was interrupted by the Treaty of Paris, and so now the Treaty of Paris offers a couple of very instructive lessons for us. One, it offers, again, within international law, as understood at that time, the transfer of the right of conquest from Spain to the United States. So it's clear where the instruments of authority lie. They lied with Spain, now they've moved over to the United States. It acknowledged the native inhabitants that the native inhabitants had civil and political rights that were not specified in the treaty, but they were to be determined at some point in time by Congress. So that acknowledgement is very important, because that acknowledgement is that there's a group of people, they're the native inhabitants, as we understood it in 1898, those are your grandparents and your great-grandparents, if you're Chamorro. Those were the people that were being discussed in terms of political change for Guam. So that's a very important acknowledgement. Of course, it created the unincorporated territory. And so now that's a different phenomena. That's an internal U.S. phenomena that a lot of us are not not familiar with. But originally, the whole idea was that every territory of the United States, going back to the Northwest Ordinance, was that every territory was a state, an embryonic state, was a state in waiting. They just had enough people and they waited long enough, they'll become a state. People who moved there were citizens, statehood was the next step. Of course, they went and created this new phenomena by Supreme Court based on a customs case involving Puerto Rico, that these people who are now being acquired, Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, primarily, under the Treaty of Paris, were now unincorporated territories. They were not on a track to statehood. They were territories of the United States, but they were not part of. They were they were owned, but not part of the United States. So that freed the distinction. You know, this is the comparable court case in American social policy at the time is Plessy versus Ferguson, which was separate but equal, which was the same Supreme Court that gave us Plessy versus Ferguson is the Supreme Court that gave us unincorporated territory. See, so for those of you separate but equal fans, you were Guam, you were separate but equal. Equally separate. I don't know. I don't know what the thinking was at the time, but you were not part of the United States. Now, that meant that they could deny you citizenship. You know, you're owned by the United States, you're now coming in, but they can deny you citizenship. It meant they can give you, they can apply parts of the Constitution to you, but not all of it. They can decide. This is the plenary power of the U.S. Congress that was decided. This is a very important point because there are people now who are arguing that we should become an incorporated territory. But I want you to really have a lot of introspection about that, you know, because, you know, you have to go retro, go back to this time, kind of understand it, and then be thinking about what that really means, because it may sound a little bit better than it actually turns out to be. So you have the denial of citizenship. Then you had the naval government. The naval government was in its form and in its function and in its rationale was based on the notion that the people of Guam, the Chamorro people, needed tutelage. They were kind of like in a period of constant education, and the naval authorities were acting, and interestingly, again, within the legal framework, they were acting out of the executive branch of the federal government, not out of the legislature. They weren't acting out of Congress, they were acting out of executive, because Congress had not made any law, which goes back to the Treaty of Paris. They were waiting for Congress to pass a law with respect to the civil and political rights of the native inhabitants. In the absence of that, what you had is naval government. Now, of course, then it was obvious that the Chamorro opposition to the worst forms of naval government was framed in terms of citizenship. If we acquired citizenship, then they wouldn't treat us this way. So the action, the initial action by people like, Mr. Leon Guerrero, F.B. Leon Guerrero, B.J. Bordallo, was all orchestrated around the idea that they should become U.S. Citizens, and that would cure it. The opposition to U.S. citizenship, when it almost reached that point in the Senate, came from the Secretary of the Navy. His justification was simple. The people of Guam should be happy the way they are because we're giving them everything, we're not charging them, and they're not ready yet to have the title U.S. citizen applied to them. Now, in that time frame, there's always one thing I always find it curious. There was a governor by the name of Governor Bradley who created these general elections for the Guam Congress. Everybody celebrates that as a kind of a milestone. But I use this point just to point out, when they had that first election for the Guam Congress in 1931, lots of excitement. People went out and voted, and they elected 2 houses to the Guam Congress. In the next election, when they realized that there was really no power to the Guam Congress, there wasn't enough people to fill the vacancies. People said, what's the point in running? So if anybody thinks that these people were kind of children in need of tutelage, they weren't. What did they call that Guam Congress in those days? Congresun Damut. Testicle Congress. Spent Congress. They knew it. I mean, that was the common refrain. Pabi membro ki Congresun Damut. And that's exactly what they called the Guam Congress. So the whole idea, this notion that the people of Guam were in kind of unaware about what was going on is simply wrong. People understood it. I was asked, in reviewing the history of Guam, I learned that the valedictorian for the first graduating class of Seton Schroeder Junior High School was Richard Taitano. So, my mother's brother. So I asked him, so Uncle Richard, what was your speech like in there? He goes, oh, I don't know, they wrote it for me. Was something like, stay on the farm, be happy to be a farmer, and, always clean your latrine, or something along that line. So, this preoccupation, it was a very guided kind of experience. But that didn't mean that the people didn't understand that. My point is that people understood it even in those days. And even people who submitted petitions early on, even when you go back to the time period when the Spaniards left and the U.S. naval government was fully established, there was a 6-month period there where one of the mayor of Agana, Paris, instituted a lot of changes. They understood what needed to happen. So the people were not ignorant. People were not children. People knew that they had certain rights and that they wanted to exercise them. Now, World War II, again, gave us a different time frame. So now we go into the Japanese occupation, and there's a new kind of political rhetoric that adds to the fervent voice of the quest for U.S. citizenship, and that is loyalty. So it's not just that we should be given U.S. citizenship just because, nobody else had to work hard for it. People in the Virgin Islands didn't have to work hard for U.S. citizenship. The U.S. bought it from the Danes, and 12 years later, they just passed a law and said, okay, you guys are U.S. citizens. But the people of Guam had been waiting all this time, so they had to give it kind of a new argument. So that new argument that was given was loyalty. Now that political argument continues to this day. Every kind of argument that we give always focuses around loyalty. Not around your rights, not around your human rights, but as a kind of a reward for loyalty. It's a very strong part of the Chamorro cultural worldview. I think that comes from the whole idea of, reciprocity. I did this for you, I suffered for you, this kind of worldview, this is how we're supposed to get along. Not give me this right. Why? Because I'm human. I don't have to prove my loyalty. I don't have to prove anything. The notion of human rights doesn't proceed from loyalty. The notion of human rights proceeds from being human. And last time I checked, Chamorros were human. Now, the quest for U.S. citizenship then had that tone to it. And the predictable opposition originally, of course, came from the Navy in a certain light, There's one quote that's always used, that's been used a lot, and that is by F.B. Leon Guerrero. By this time, the struggle was led by Mr. Leon Guerrero and the speaker's father, Mr. Wampat. And one quote that's often used about F.B. Leon Guerrero is that he went to Congress and he said, there's always only going to be one ism in Guam, and that's Americanism. And that quote has been used a lot. Now, I thought about that for years, and I kept wondering, why would he? This was the man. F.B. Leon Guerrero was a little bit different than all the other political leaders on Guam. He was the most confrontational. He was clearly the most confrontational. There's the story of the governor getting off his horse and giving him the reins and saying, no, I'm not your stable boy. There's all these things, he refused to stand up whenever the governor walked in. There were all these kinds of stories about Mr. Leon Guerrero. And so why would he say this? There's only one ism in Guam, and that's Americanism. So, there's some of it might be related to the fact that the way Mr. F.B. Leon Guerrero was dealt with by some of the naval authorities was they characterized him as being pro-communist, which was a favorite canard in the 40s and the 50s. And the only way that Mr. Leon Guerrero could defend himself was to say that he was for only one ism. But we also had in there new friends and a new international climate. There was a very vibrant liberal movement inside the U.S. Society. There was a different international climate, the creation of the United Nations, the UN Charter, the recognition of non-self-governing territories. All of these things came at the same time that there was this political fomenting that was going on in Guam, the congressional walkout, all of this attention. And so this resulted in the Organic Act. Okay, the full story of this, how much was done in relationship to new friendships in Washington, D.C., we'll never know. There was one well-known attorney by the name of Richard Wells who was actually out here as a naval attorney in 1945 and 1946, very upset by what he saw. He went back to practicing law in New York, had a good friend who was editor of the New York Times, and almost on a regular basis thereafter, there was a letter to the editor that was published in the New York Times almost every month about Guam. So, you know, there's all these things that are going on at the same time, that there's all this political foment. So it resulted in the Organic Act. Now, by that time, of course, the word Chamorro had shifted, and people no longer use the term Chamorro. They now use the term Guamanian. Now we're redefining Guamanian today. I don't want to get involved in that, but, you know, Anyways, back in 1950, when the Organic Act was passed, it was clear what was meant by Guamanian. So that term, so the only people who were declared citizens en masse were people born on Guam who had ancestry going back to before 1898, which meant that it could only be the Chamorro people. It also recognized that they had, gave preference to, in government of Guam employment, preference was given to persons of Guamanian ancestry, and that continued all the way until 1970, and many people don't know, as a trade-off for elective governorship. When elected governorship was passed, they took out the preference for people of Guamanian ancestry from the Organic Act, and that was orchestrated by then Congresswoman Mink from Hawaii. So the Organic Act became the place which recognized Guamanians as a political category. So this still has political life that's very different than just saying Chamorro people are an indigenous group. Chamorros being an indigenous group adds to that, but there's also a clear legal line in how we define Guamanians as passed in federal legislation and in things going back to the Treaty of Paris, which does not exist in other territories. So, you know, it's a little bit stronger line for us. Now, there are some people who argue that we should just be content with incremental progress. And there's been a lot of incremental progress. I would venture to say that outside this room, 80% of the people are more concerned with incremental progress than the exercise of Chamorro self-determination. I mean, that's the reality of it. So how do we measure this incremental progress? Participation in the Great Society program of the 1960s. You know, up until the time of the presidency of LBJ, the government of Guam almost participated in no federal programs. After that, Title I, Title II, Title III, you name every title you want, there was enough federal money to employ everybody on the island. So the whole notion that this was being made possible. And how was this being made possible? Well, one of the things that is going on, of course, is that we elected, at that time, we elected Mr. Wampat to go to Washington, D.C., and that was part of his task. Even though he wasn't an elected member of the U.S. House, it was part of his task to continue to seek this federal funding. So you had the federal funding, the urban renewal, all of this money that started to pump into Guam. The budget of the government of Guam in the 1960s grew by about 500%. So, you know, for people looking at that saying, well, what's there to argue with? You know, this is good progress. This is something that we ought to take a look at. Same thing, elective governorship passed in actually a little bit earlier than that, but we had our first elected governor in 1970, elected delegate in 1972, increased reliance on federal funding and participation as determination of progress, political progress, social progress, and all of this money, if people were asked, did you deserve this money? Did you deserve to get urban renewal? Did you deserve to participate in these federal programs? You don't pay taxes. You're not putting one nickel into that federal kitty, but you're drawing from it. People say, yes, we deserve it, because why? Because we were loyal in World War II. That's the drumbeat. We're loyal. We were loyal in World War II, and then added to that the notion of Guam's emerging role in military strategy, and also the fact of the high rates of participation by young men of Guam in the Korean War, Vietnam War, and men and women in subsequent wars. This is a very important part of our political thinking. So, you know, it's almost like we live in this bifurcated world. On one day, we're angry about the lack of tomorrow self-determination. And the other day, we're angry about not being rewarded for our loyalty. Well, we want to be loyal, we want to be disloyal, we want to be part of, we don't want to be part of. What's going on? People, because of this kind of constant churning and mixture, I think, of historical metaphors. That's why I'm not here to clarify which metaphor you should go for, but I am here to point out that there are mixed historical metaphors out there that are constantly part of the political dialogue. And when you're out there conversing with people, not everyone shares the same metaphor. Not everyone invests the same meaning into each and every historical circumstance. And because they don't do that, you just think they are. Well, they must understand it the way I do. But maybe it's not all that clear. So, now then, the counter distinction is, well, it's not incremental progress, it's fundamental political status change. Now, up until the 70s, the people of Guam were content with the incremental change and the fact that they were getting larger and larger amounts of federal assistance as a reward for their loyalty. So they kind of led themselves to believe this, you know. So, as a reward for loyalty. So now they started talking about political status change. Well, what started that? Well, I think what started it is the conversations that started to occur in Saipan, but under the leadership of the Congress of Micronesia, when they started talking about political status change. So now what you had in the political leadership of Guam is they've been trying to talk to federal leaders for a long time about, you know, can we talk about our political future? People would say, well, what, are you unhappy? You need more money? What is it that you want, really? And they say, no, you know, there's no need to have these conversations. And these were to people who were loyal. Well, now, all of a sudden, 1970, 71 comes around, there's federal official after federal official flying right into Guam and then flying right out to go to Saipan to have these conversations, high-level conversations with Micronesian leaders about a political future. And the people of Guam, at least the political leadership, felt like, well, you know, what happened to the reward for loyalty? I thought we were going to get acknowledged for this loyalty. Didn't work out that way. Instead, what you had happen was that the international climate, the concern about the UN putting pressure on the US and what was going on in Micronesia, all of these things were churning at the same time, and it was obvious that the US government had to pay attention to that, And so they did. And so what was happening to the people of Guam? Nothing. So the Guam legislature, as they have done, I think, for the past few years, you know, there's another dynamic at work. Who's in charge of self-determination for Guam? Is it the Guam legislature or is it the governor? Well, we want to say outwardly that we're all in charge and we're all getting along and we're all happy to work it all out. But in reality, usually it's either the legislature is driving the show or the governor is driving the show. Well, originally it was the Guam legislature. That goes back to the 12th and the 13th and the 14th Guam legislatures. It was the legislature that was driving the show. And so they were the ones who were writing the articles in the newspaper and kind of pushing the envelope, causing a political status referendum to occur. You remember that political status referendum in 1976? You could go there, and I think they had like 15 options. No, they didn't have. I think they had 6 or 7 options. And the option that won, 51%, was status quo with improvements. Now, who wouldn't like that? I want things to stay the same, only better. So that was the option that won. I think they put that option in just so that people would say, yeah, that status quo with improvements, not just status quo, period. Not the kind of scenario that Carla has outlined is going on with Puerto Rico, where it just says status quo, period. This one is status quo with improvements. Well, that's what won. Well, in the meantime, of course, this is the so-called secret offer, which it's called secret because we never heard of it. That was a good secret. When you don't hear about it, it was a secret well kept. So in that conversation, in that what is going on in Micronesia, in that conversation is that the U.S. has to kind of reinforce its flexibility, its military flexibility. So they're negotiating a separate arrangement with what emerges to be the CNMI. So in that process, they're negotiating a separate arrangement. Now, you know, if you were like a long-time political observer in Guam in 1975 and you're watching this, you're thinking, these people in the CNMI, well, you know, we just had a referendum in 1968 and they asked the people of Guam, do you want to reunite with the CNMI? And we said, no! Then they asked the people in the northern, do you want to reunite with Guam? And they said yes. Now, you fast forward that 7 years later, and every federal official in the world is talking to these people, but they're not talking to anybody from Guam. So it was a very dispiriting time to be in political leadership in that context in Guam. So the CNMI has this, so, you know, a little bit of pressure. So obviously there was a memo put out that if Guam starts to agitate for anything, we would give them the same thing that we're giving those, we'll give Guam the same thing that we're giving to the CNMI. Yeah, so yeah, we'll give the loyal people the same thing. I heard this from Ben. Ben shouted it out, but I didn't, Senator Pangilinan. But that's the mindset, and it's true, Senator Pangilinan. The mindset in the 70s was that they're going to give to the loyal people of Guam the same thing that they gave to those disloyal people in Saipan. You know, this was the kind of the popular mindset. But in actuality, what was happening was that international events were kind of driving the show. So the Northern Marianas got this Commonwealth deal, which apparently they're now rethinking. But at the time, it seemed like a very progressive deal, a lot of internal control that was really absent in the case of Guam. So what happens is that in response to this secret offer, Congress decides that they're going to assert their control over the political status process. So what they did is, all right, since the president should not be, the executive should not be talking to these individual territories, we have to give the territories something. So they gave the territories the right to create a constitution. a locally so congressional action, assertion of authority, is to then offer the Constitution. So they offered Guam the right to form a constitution. They offered the USVI the right to form a constitution. Guam tried it once. The VI, I think, is on their 5th attempt. Is it the 5th attempt? 5 constitutions later, they still haven't ratified it, but they've done it 5 times. But Guam only tried it once. But basically, the role of the executive branch has receded in this process and has deferred it to Congress, and that's where we stand. All right. So now you had the Constitution, the ratification process, in which Marilyn and I had a very important role. So, Senator Manabusan, excuse me. The Guam Constitution campaign reveals that there were kind of like these 2 fundamental different views about political process. One said, yeah, we should go with the incremental changes, and the other said, no, we should just, go for the whole political status thing first, and then you build a constitution around it. So that was the fundamental issue at stake. Of course, then the Constitution failed, and so then the people of Guam were kind of left like, well, what are we going to do next? In the meantime, a few people had discovered the UN process. So the first people to go to the United Nations were me, Ron Tehan, who's in the audience, and Chris Perez Howard. So we bought ourselves a suit and went to New York. I only had one suit in those days. No longer fit. So anyway, so we went to New York and we testified. I prepared the testimony and I testified in front of the UN. So that was, kind of a highly charged moment for us because, A, we didn't know, obviously nobody in government of Guam supported us. No self-respecting legislature at the time even wanted to talk to us about it. What? You're going to the UN? What's wrong with you? So anyways, we just bit the bullet and went ahead. And I have to say that as I was talking, the biggest fans I had were the representatives from Iraq and Cuba. They were my biggest fans. Ron kept saying, let's go talk to them. And I kept saying, no. Ron was all about, yeah, let's go talk to them. I said, no, I don't think so. I don't know who these guys are. We already did what we did. Let's get a couple of tickets to some Broadway show while we're here. Okay. So then, of course, the government of Guam, the political powers decided that this was a time to create a commission on self-determination. So it's no longer the Commission on Political Status. So the term Commission on Self-Determination, was instructive. It created a different sense to it. And of course, at the very, the governor is the one who takes charge of this. So it's the governor is the one that's going to take charge of this process. And of course, some governors paid a lot of attention to it. Some governors paid no attention to it. But I'm not going to tell you which governors. You can draw that for yourself. Some governors paid a lot of attention to this responsibility. Some governors, don't even know what these words mean. So anyways. So the first question that is raised in the whole notion of the Commission on Self-Determination is, who's the self? Obviously that's the next question. If we're going to be determining, well, who's self? Who's the self-determination? That was the original question when Governor Calvo convened it. And it was the original question by Richard Taitano. And he was a member. And he says, until you answer this, I'm not coming back. And he never came back. Because no one wanted to answer it. But, I don't know, We don't know what we really mean by the self. I don't know who I am. I'm out of gas. All right, here we go. So then out of this Commission on Self-Determination came the Commonwealth Draft Act. So then you had the Commonwealth Draft Act. They said put in the kitchen sink, so they did. They put everything in that Commonwealth Draft Act. You name it, it was like, that Commonwealth Draft Act was like a combination of the incremental progress and the fundamental political status change. It was like, we're not letting anything get by us. We're going to put everything that we ever wanted in this draft act. And so that's what happened. And so there were 12 different articles, some on transportation, some on immigration, some on Chamorro self-determination, kind of hinted at Chamorro self. Was very cleverly worded. Didn't say it directly, but kind of worded that around Chamorro self-determination. And so those were Articles 1 and 7. 7 was immigration, and Article 1 referred to Chamorro self-determination. So under Gov Guam law, if these articles, they sent out the 12 articles, and if the articles did not pass, then the commission was going to rewrite the articles and then put them out again. So the articles didn't pass, but the commission said, no, we're not going to rewrite the articles. We'll just have another election and hope more people show up. So then you had the Friends of Article 1 and 7 movement, and they eventually got it passed. So that was the approach. Now, of course, that was done, the decision at the time was they were going to go all or nothing. And so, when you go all or nothing, sometimes you end up with nothing. All right. So that's what we ended up with, nothing. So then, the reintroduction of the act, this was the only, we had a congressional hearing on the first draft act in Hawaii, I think in 1989, I'm not sure, 1989. It was, it was called a congressional field hearing. When you see the word congressional field hearing, it means nobody's there except maybe 1 or 2 members of Congress, But so that field hearing actually had only Delegate DeLugo there in Honolulu. Then in 1997, we had the congressional hearing, and now that hearing, I think we had like about over 25 members of the Resources Committee at that hearing. Now that took a lot of work on my part. I had to go around and talk to a lot of members. And so they all said, all right, okay, I'll sit there. How long am I supposed to sit there? I said, can you sit there for at least 15 minutes? Okay, 15 minutes. They're all looking at their watch. So at least there was a bigger turnout. But of course the results were the same. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. There was the mood in Congress was affected by a lot of different things. There was the fight between the Republican-controlled Congress and President Clinton. There was a fight over political donations. All kinds of things were going on, which kind of soured the process. So it kind of came back, and now the Guam legislature has kind of again reasserted its authority, and this time it has introduced legislation which kind of parallels the process that Carlisle has outlined here, which is to call it now, we're no longer calling it the Commission on Self-Determination, we're now calling it the Commission on Decolonization, and we now have a process, Chamorro registry, in order to make this happen. So the question at the end of the day is for people that are sitting out there at home who may be wondering, what isn't for me? Am I agitated by this whole process because I'm being denied my right as an American? Or am I being denied my inalienable right to self-determination, which goes back hundreds of years? That's really the context for a lot of the thinking that is going on out there. Now, the denial of consent of the governed. The current system is colonial, not because the U.S. government is composed of people who are mean and evil. It's because it is a denial of a basic tenet of American democracy. It is an un-American government. And that is that government proceeds from consent of the governed. It does not. The government of Guam exists as a result of an act of Congress. A Congress in which there is no voting member from Guam. So there is no consent of the governed. When I was in Congress, in the Capitol building, they have a credit union office. I love to go to that credit union office, check how much money I have. Go to the credit union, and as in Congress everywhere, in the Capitol building, they have little sayings all over the place. And there's a saying right above that credit union office that says, the only legitimate right to govern is consent of the governed. And that was William Henry Harrison. And I always like to point that out because William Henry Harrison was not only president of the United States, he was also a territorial delegate. His first elected office was to be a delegate, not a representative. But his first was to be a delegate to the U.S. House. He also was the only president. I think he died 30 days in office, something like that. So some people say, is this the perfection of American citizenship? Or is this the completion of Chamorro self-determination? That's a very live conversation out there. It's a very live issue. In much the same way that originally in the American Revolution and all the way through it, there were some people who were agitated because they were being denied their rights as Englishmen. The English government was denying us Englishmen who lived in the colonies, so the story went, our rights as Englishmen. And then there were some who said, no, we're forming a new nation. We're forming a different reality. We're talking about whereas in the course of human events, and they had a different sense of it. So these are the competing views of history and I think strategies for ultimate resolution. And out of regard and respect for those, there are people who see this as the effort to perfect our relationship with the U.S., to perfect our status as Americans, are more likely to fall along the idea that we should try to exhaust all efforts to make us an incorporated territory. We should move in that direction. We should acquire more federal funding. We should get more benefits from this relationship. Whereas others will say, no, we have to stop, take a deep breath, and try to get this process of Chamorro self-determination once and for all. But even in that process of Chamorro self-determination, it's unclear where the Chamorros will vote if they actually came to this issue. So in disentangling the history of Guam and the Chamorro people, I still believe we need to go retro. We need to go back and think about this past. We need to understand it before we can go become introspective. I firmly believe that the Chamorro people have been denied their right to self-determination, and that unless this is first addressed in Hagatna, there will never be a permanent solution to Guam's political status. The Chamorro people have that right. I also recognize that legal authority over Guam exists in Washington, D.C., and not at the United Nations in New York. The federal government holds the instruments of government in all its forms that exist in Guam. The federal government holds the power and the authority. In the struggle between right and power, right and might, if you will, we can all come to different conclusions about which will prevail. We can be realists and give in to those who argue that whatever is decided in Washington, D.C. must serve as our guide. We can be dreamers and argue that Chamorro self-determination is the cause of our generation, the cause of our time, the cause of our existence. History is a tough teacher, and there's room for realist lessons and dreamer lessons. The inspiration of our experiences will always fuel our aspirations, but idle dreaming and visionary thinking will never be sufficient. Whomever is willing to work the hardest, whomever is willing to perspire the most, it is their aspiration which will take hold, and it is them that will build a future for our island, for Guam. Thank you very much.